Thank you very much. It feels a bit like a homecoming coming to this region. I took the train up to Leicester so many times for so many years, so it was very nice to go through the station again. So thank you very much for having me here. Yes, I was thinking after Joseph and Patrick, the Germanic theme, my mother being German, my father being Austrian, so here we are, Brexit. Very international. I have a British passport. But it's been quite an adventure. I came to the States in 2000 from New York for personal reasons, and it was quite a journey. It feels like 30 years. It hasn't been 30 years, but and it's been incredibly interesting to operate in a new environment. I think the best thing to do in terms of understanding, and this was a very interesting exercise to do for myself, is to really look at what it means to set up a practice in the UK, a foreign practice in the UK, a large foreign practice in the UK, versus setting up one's own practice, and sort of the differences and the differences in struggle. I came in 2000 simply because I went to Raphael and I said, "Thank you very much, Mr. Vignoli, I'd like to quit. I've had a wonderful time, but I would like to marry somebody in London and I'm moving." And he sort of said, no, finish your building in Princeton, let's talk about it. Let's open an office in London. So there was no business plan, there was no thought process behind it beyond that. I was 29, so I was very young. And it was sort of probably a little bit daunting initially, but very quickly and very luckily we got a letter from Amsterdam saying you've been commissioned to do a project in Amsterdam. So suddenly there was something for me to do here. But the process, I stayed with RVA setting up their practice, so I came in 2000 as one person, and by the time I left we were 50 people. I think it was probably the hardest thing I did. I probably didn't sleep very much throughout the process, but I think this lack of knowledge and this youth and the lack of understanding of what it takes to get a job into the office was probably the biggest asset. And had I known what it would take, I probably would have felt a little bit more daunted. So looking back at the history, and here I'm only showing the history of RVA London when it relates to my being there. So I haven't looked at RVA London, which carries on flourishing. But over 6 years, we secured 70, or we worked on 70, we didn't secure 70 projects, we worked on 17 projects, 11 of which were competitions, and 6 of which got built. And the overall construction value of the 6 projects is 600 million. So it's quite a substantial construction value. So essentially we were focusing on very large projects with very complex planning. The office started working in Holland, so I became a Dutch registered architect, and we did 3 projects out there. And then it took about 2 years to secure Leicester, and Leicester was the first UK project. And I remember picking up Raphael at the airport, and we had put together a presentation, and I said to Raphael, "You better perform, because if we don't get this job, I'm not doing it anymore." And thankfully, he did perform, and we managed to secure the project, and it was a great adventure. But it, by all means, wasn't an easy thing to do, and I think probably it was an invited competition. We were the odd duck out. We were the ones who never built in the UK. I wasn't a British registered architect. I was very young, so there were all these things that sort of made us quite different. And rather than trying to be like the others, we decided to show our difference and saying we are different and we bring a different perspective. And I think that's what worked. But through the work and through some of the projects, it remained very international. And I think that's one of the key things that I learned, is that if you are able to have this flexibility to move around and to be able to adapt to different cultures, it gives you a much better chance of sort of throwing your chips around, and some of them will take and some of them won't. So that was the experience of working in Holland. This was the first building. It was a master plan. The building shape was pretty much done. And we created the idea of having a staircase that wraps around the entire building. But the interesting part of this project is that we were associated with a contractor and developer who resisted us initially, and eventually we ended up doing more work for them. But this work abroad and working with local firms, this was the first one that I did, and it was really very much a seminal project for me personally in terms of understanding of how to work abroad and respecting the local culture and the local way of working. So rather than bringing our own practice as, at the time, American architecture firm, we took a very respectful approach and tried to understand how the Dutch work, why they do certain things in the way they do, and how can we adapt and bring something else to the table. The Curve Theatre in Leicester was obviously our first UK project, and again we while competing with only British firms at the time, showed ourselves to be quite different. The portfolio of RVA in New York, having an enormous amount of performing arts centre, was obviously very helpful in getting us to secure this project. And it was there were a group of project managers who I won't name, but who said, we all know that you can all design buildings, now let us know how you can deliver projects. And in the shortlist there were people like Foster, so we all knew that they could deliver projects. So we felt that actually, no, that's the wrong question to ask. Everyone here can deliver a project. Let's see who can understand the brief of the client the best. And that was the theatre turned inside out, and we started really talking about what that means, how we could do this, and I think that was what charmed them and got us the project. Colchester was another one, an invited competition. Again, we decided to show ourselves as different, so they gave us a site, they gave us a building, they gave us a street, and we sort of decided that that wasn't, they had made the wrong decision, and we proposed a different site, and that was probably a little bit contentious, but actually it was the right move, and so we ended up with this lovely building. Holland, again, we did 3 projects there. Wonderful place to work. The people are always very nice. You always end up having nice beer and something pickled. But we did this plant research building, and the quality of construction and conducting meetings in Dutch was always quite funny, but we ended up doing a wonderful project. 20 Fenchurch, I think I call this my planning PhD. It was a very complex planning project. It got called in. I was part through the planning. I wasn't part of it through the construction, and when it was a joint venture with Canary Wharf. But it was the fact that there was a 90-meter tower on the site. We were outside of the cluster, and we managed to secure this planning application. Was quite something. And this is a project that I show. This was a project that never got built in Holland, but the notion of stacking up 4 multiple buildings, the master plan and the city architect wanted a 200-meter tower. The economics of Amsterdam for office towers at the time wasn't secure enough, so the client only wanted to put a certain amount of square footage on the site. And so we came up with the idea that you stretch the building and you put 4 gardens, and essentially you stack 4 buildings on a site. Was an idea that could both respond to the height and the size requirement. And maybe it's an idea that we'll pick up again another time. So in 2006, I finally managed to quit. Raphael allowed me this time. But we set up a practice, and it was very much, the office had grown to 60 people. I think that I had become deinstitutionalized because I was given a lot of freedom, and suddenly when the office was 50 people, New York was a little bit more interested and wanted a bit more input into it, and I just sort of felt at the time that I was ready to move on. And then this character walked into my house one day and said, I want to build a house in Zimbabwe. Would you do it? Which was a very odd idea. I just didn't think that people were doing anything in Zimbabwe. So that was the cue, essentially, to move on and do something. And the interesting part of that was that the project, I started it with another person, and we were 2 people on the project, and we ended up doing every single drawing, model, 3D modeling, etc. ourselves, which is something that I had kind of lost with a larger team. And so bringing back to really having a tiny firm and dealing with absolutely every aspect of that was something wonderful that we really enjoyed very much. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. This is our new office. We moved in July, and we're very excited. It's sort of, we were in horrible cramped offices for 10 years, and so now to have the space and a wonderful team is great, and to have big windows and natural light, which we didn't have before. We've also invested enormously in our model shop, and here you can see Win, who joined us from Vienna, from Coop Himmelblau, and he's absolutely an essential character in the office. He's currently doing some sculptural pieces that we're preparing for Frieze, but there is very much the iteration of not just drawing on the computer. Of course we do 3D modeling, of course we do all of that, but the old-fashioned idea of building models is something that we keep referring back to and keep doing more and more. And there's some projects that we only do in model and then eventually go to drawing, and that's been incredibly interesting. So I've done the same timeline for Studio Seilern, and this is over 10 years. And you can see here, in comparison to our VA having 17 projects over 5 years or 6 years, we've done 51 projects, and of which 24 are either built or under construction. So it's, in a sense, the pace and the number of projects that you deal with is far greater. But it's a little bit, when we did this exercise of comparing our VA and SSA, it's sort of, I said, I feel a bit like in the hamster wheel. It's sort of the effort that you have to make in order to get your ideas built. And the number of projects that you have to deal with is far greater, simply because you're starting from the point of having not a turnover, not a portfolio, as you would from a large practice. And then we've kind of also compared the value per person, per employee. So we are 26, and so we are just under £5 million per person through that 10-year period, where at RVA through the 6-year period we were about over 6 million. We were over 12 million, 24 million pounds per person. So it's also, you can see that a small practice, purely in terms of crass efficiency, works far less well than a larger practice does, and I think that's no surprise. We have moved now into the larger projects, but we do want to keep the smaller projects simply for that one aspect that I was talking about, the fact that you kind of, when you only deal with the very large projects, you do tend to lose a sense of the scale and a sense of the detail, and that was one of the wonderful things of doing the Zimbabwe project, is that you really sort of had to re-engage with that. So I've made the decision now to both constantly keep with the smaller scale and the larger scale. So our larger project in Lithuania is worth in UK pounds about 45 million pounds, and we are also dealing, that's under construction, and we're dealing with other projects which are much more modest, but just as interesting. Obviously, when we started the practice, as any London practice, we did a lot of residential and retail, which were wonderful, and we ended up doing some lovely projects, but it's sort of, you did feel, coming from doing the curve and doing the walkie-talkie, that there was an element of challenge that you wanted to regain. And so here I'm showing you the UK projects, which you can see start off at a much more modest scale, and then I'll show you some of the foreign projects which are of much greater scale, and that probably was one of the reasons we moved on. This is a gallery we did in Oxfordshire, which has been very successful. And following our larger projects abroad, we've now been able to compete in larger competitions. So this was an invited competition for Wellington College Performing Arts Centre with a capacity of 1,400, which is now under construction, and so we're now sort of moving into that larger scale, and also sort of working more and more with developers. So this is Queensbury House, a project on Savile Row, Ansdell Street, which is an office building in Kensington, a new build which is completing in about a month's time, and now moving on to the African work. I don't work 5 minutes, yes, I'll brush. I don't work in the Middle East, but we started, this was the project that got me out of our VA, this project in Zimbabwe, hugely ambitious in a very, very difficult place to work. You have Mugabe, we had a change of currency, we have hyperinflation, etc. And I think the fact that the client was so visionary and the patronage was so good in this particular case, it really attracted me to this project. And I have to say it's been a hugely important project for us. Following that, and following the fact that we set up in 2006, and as you know, 2008 wasn't a great year for architects, I just thought, well, it's either I downsize and end up not doing very much work, or we go abroad. And I literally took 3 people from the office and we went to Nigeria, and just knowing from people that the place was booming, and we went and had something like 25 meetings and came back with 4 projects. Out of those 4 projects, one of them is getting built, and maybe the other one will get built. So it's highly risky. It's highly risky stuff. So this is one project which may get built. I hope so. It's a wonderful project. It's one of our key projects. But this one, for example, will never get built because simply the patronage in some of these places and the clients in some of these places, while they have visions of great architecture and using foreign architects, do not always pull through and sort of do not want to invest. This is a master plan we did in Abuja, in the capital, and that's now starting under construction. Phase 1 is under construction, and we shall see. Who knows? Who knows? It's sort of, you really don't have a lot of control. This is our largest project in Lithuania. I think it is also one of our most important projects, and that was purely a personal connection. I knew 3 brothers who had moved there. They were looking for an architect. They liked our work, but working in Lithuania, which has been a country that hasn't ruled itself for about 700 years until 91, was very difficult. The local architect said absolutely no to everything we proposed. He said we wouldn't get planning for anything. We ended up hiring a young Lithuanian architect out of a bar, and I asked him to translate all the planning documents, and we ended up doing the planning ourselves, which is very unusual, and I wouldn't recommend it. But we ended up getting planning for absolutely everything, and actually the council ended up changing their own planning regulations to suit this particular project because they understood that what we were proposing was making sense, and they appreciated the fact that I knew their planning regulations better than any of them at the end. So we do a lot of work in Switzerland because I grew up there and I understand it. So this was the first project which is built, a residential project in the mountains. A lot of mountain architecture, maybe because I grew up on a mountain. This is a restaurant and 2 cable car stations at 2,500 meters in Andermatt. And you know, the ability to do meetings in Swiss German, which I don't really speak, but it's quite interesting. But the sort of ability to really understand the culture, I think, has helped enormously, and the fact that probably I grew up on the mountain has helped the process enormously for them. And we also, this is a project in Greece, which we're about to start construction. Another master plan in Greece. So it was very much this notion of just daring to go out there and find other projects and find larger projects that allowed us to come back to the UK and show a more important portfolio and probably also a more important turnover that allowed us then to move into larger projects in the UK. And I think, well, I don't know if that's important, but it seems that it does work for some people. And so that's Wellington, and hopefully in 18 months' time you'll see it. So, thank you.